started here, Sunday school. If somebody wouldn't mind shutting those doors as well, that'd be helpful. Sure, more will filter in here in a few minutes. Before we actually get started with Sunday school, I wanted to mention something, which is we sometimes in our church we take an offering with this thing. We pass it around, and Sunday school offering. If you have extra cash that you'd like to give, you can. We haven't been doing that in this class, but I thought of a good use for that if you'd like to contribute toward it, which is, I don't know if all of you know this, but we have a young adult group that meets at Lockwood over at the barn on Saturday nights. So this is like college age kids from 18 to 20, 30? Okay, to 30. And they have a good group going there, like, I don't know, maybe 20 people, right? 20, 25, depends on the night. Well, anyway, that age group oftentimes gets overlooked and doesn't have a lot going for it. We don't give any money towards it as a church or anything like that, and but they're doing good things. It's led by Lockwood people, and some of them are in this room right now, like Serena and others. But it's they go through the scriptures and talk with each other about it, ask questions to each other, and I think it's a really good group. We have kids coming from other churches or who don't go to church that are going to that, and so it's a good ministry. So I'm going to start passing around this every week. If you'd like to contribute to it, we'll try to build up a fund and then make sure the money goes through the right channels and then gets well used for that. So okay, sure. Start over here with Jason. And you don't have to give at all. Don't feel bad about turning, just passing it on. That's fine. All right, we're in Genesis chapter 4. And we're going to be in the genealogies today. It sounds like an interesting class, huh? Have you ever done a family tree before? You ever traced your ancestry, used the websites, ancestry.com? Okay. A lot of you are shaking your heads, yes. Why did you do that? Required school project. A lot of people do this. And, if I were to do it, which I haven't done it, but if I were to do it, it'd be because I want to know more about myself. Isn't that why most people do it? It's not that I want to know about my great-grandma's second cousin or something like that, right? It's because I want to know where I came from. I want to know, a little more about why I am the way I am, how I came to be, right? Maybe I'm related to some famous person, and that kind of gives me an anchor in history or something. Would you ever find a random person on the street and ask them their genealogy, what their ancestry is? I probably wouldn't. I just would not care, right? I don't know you, so I don't care who you came from, right? Just being honest, right? But we want to know what's relevant to us, and we might be interested in some famous person. Have you ever looked up like King Charles's ancestry or something like that? We get kind of interested in that. Now, there are a lot of genealogies in the Bible, and we have 2 coming up here this morning in Genesis. Why do you think they're there? Any ideas? Jim? Oh, we got a mic.
It might help to establish a timeline.
Okay.
And which it does, and how this person lived this old, this person lived like this.
Yep. Tells all the ages, and yep, good. Any other reason why they might be sharing those? to legitimize the record, the historical record. Yeah?
That's right.
Good.
That's a good answer. All the promises of God are verified through the genealogy to Jesus Christ. All the promises of God are ours in Christ. When we follow the genealogy of the line of Christ, which also is in the New Testament, you'll probably bring that out, actually all the way back to Adam.
Yep.
And it just verifies, to me at least, and I think to others, that God is so faithful, even to work through all the tragedies that we see, even in the genealogy of Christ. Amazing things.
So you can see God's hand at work when you read these genealogies and
Yes,
see how he brought us
right.
through all this history, all these people.
And
Yep.
he brought it to pass to fulfillment.
That's right. To bring it to fulfillment. Yeah.
Also, I'd like, just hang on. I'd also like to clarify, because last week you said that we shout out answers, and so I thought you should clarify when the mic should be passed and when you want people to just shout out their answers. Just wanted to say.
Sure. Thanks.
Sometimes people wonder, why are the genealogies there? You know, it's not. We had a Bible translator friend who was out working in a tribal group, and she was translating Matthew, got to the first part, and they then talked about that a little bit, and then she said, well, let's go on to the better part. And a fellow looked at her and said, This means it's true, because all of these histories and everything made it seem like it was really true and not just a fable, not just a story that is made up. And so God at least put that there for that man as he realized that this was God's true word.
Very good. Yeah. Yep, I think this has been mentioned, but even from the beginning, God's been planning something, right? And you can see that in the genealogies. The genealogies prove status and position as well. There's a story in Nehemiah where there's some Levites who can't prove that they were actually Israelites, right? And so they were rejected from the priesthood. Jesus is last one. Dan?
Genealogies also prove that the world is not millions of years old. If you follow it, you get an approximate date much less than even 10,000 years. It's more like 6,000 if you follow the genealogies.
Yeah. One of the things that's interesting in the early chapters of Genesis is, I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but we find our own ancestry there. So we all came from Adam. We are all directly descended from his son Seth, and then from Noah, which is interesting. And now, obviously, many modern people don't believe the ancient record that we find in Genesis. They disagree about the biblical record of human origins. And I don't claim to know much about Neanderthals or cavemen or anything like that. But I know that we have an ancient genealogical record with names of real people with their own history, with their ages, with their descendants. And that doesn't read like a piece of fiction to me. All right? Why would you put actual names and actual dates in there if this was all made up, if this was a myth? And so faith is not believing things in spite of history. We believe because of history. That's something that's unique about our faith as Christians and Judaism as well. This is not just a set of laws in the Bible. This is not just a bunch of creeds or philosophies. You know, it's a historical record of what God has actually done in human history, sometimes through apostles, sometimes through prophets, and sometimes on his own through miracles, through incarnation. The fact that God actually stepped into history and did things, that is what our faith is based on. And if God did not create the world in the beginning, or if Jesus didn't really rise from the dead, then our faith is religious nonsense. A lot of religions basically are, it's just creeds or, philosophies or whatever. But we believe that the God of heaven acted in time and in space with witnesses and history to prove it. And so my point here is that one of our witnesses to the historical truth, to the witnesses that give us faith, is the genealogical record that we find in Genesis or in other places. And so I'm thankful for the genealogies, right? Let's look at them a little more closely. Chapter 4. And we're going to be starting in verse 17 of chapter 4 because we got that far last time. I'm going to read 17 through 24, so follow along with me. Cain made love to his wife, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Enoch. This is not the famous Enoch, by the way, a different one. Cain was then building a city, and he named it after his son Enoch. To Enoch was born Irad, and Irad was the father of Mehujael. That's not how you say it in Hebrew, but still a weird name. And Mehujael was the father of Methuselah, and Methuselah was the father of Lamech. Lamech married two women, one named Ada and the other Zillah. Ada gave birth to Jabal, who was the father of those who live in tents and raise livestock. His brother's name was Jubal, who was the father of all who played stringed instruments and pipes. Zillah also had a son, Tubal-Cain, who forged all kinds of tools out of bronze and iron. Tubal-Cain's sister was Naamah. Lamech said to his wives, Ada and Zillah, listen to me. Wives of Lamech, hear my words. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for injuring me. If Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech 77 times. He's talking in the third person there. The genealogies in these chapters serve important functions. The one in chapter 4, though, has a different function than the one in chapter 5. The genealogy we just read from Cain has it's trying to prove a theological point. Seth's genealogy, the author's trying to get us from point A to point B. In other words, we need to know how we got from Adam to Abraham, right? So the author of Genesis, who I take as Moses, has a particular way of organizing his material. We talked about this before. Do you remember when I talked about the Toledot sequence, which is in the English, it might say this is the account of, or these are the generations of, right? Actually, is anybody up there who can tap on the PowerPoint screen? I have a little PowerPoint up there that says Toledot sequence. Toledot is a Hebrew word meaning those things. Oh, it's right in the middle of the screen. I put it there last night. No. It says Toledot. Okay. Well, don't worry about it. Oh, you got it. Okay. Okay, good. So I wouldn't mention this, but I think it's really important to understanding Genesis. So first it talks about, we start with the generations. It's kind of like a zooming in function. So we start with the Toledot, or the account of the heavens and the earth, right? And when it does that, it starts talking about Adam and Eve. What came of the heavens and the earth? Mankind. And then we zoom in from Adam, and in chapter 5, we read about the generations of Adam. So we learn about what came from Adam's family, particularly Seth. We hear about, in the generation of Adam, we hear about Noah's story. Go to the next one, please. And then after that, we hear about Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. These are the generations of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And when we hear about them, we learn about the genealogy of Shem, and then on from that, we learn about Abraham when it talks about the generations of his dad, Terah. And so the idea here, I know that might sound a little complicated, but the idea is that we're narrowing. We are narrowing from the big picture of the heavens and the earth, and we're trying to get somewhere, right? We're narrowing from the heavens and the earth to Adam. and then from Adam to Seth's line, and then from Seth's line to Noah, and then from Noah to Abraham. We're getting somewhere, and the point is that we're narrowing to this descendant of the woman who will crush Satan's head, the seed of Abraham who's going to fulfill all the promises of the blessing, Jesus Christ. So often the genealogies are there to help the Toledot method go. So often before he shares about somebody's story, Moses will share a brief genealogy about somebody else's story. So before he goes into Seth, he starts sharing the line of Cain, okay? And so we have this description of what happened to Cain and his family. And And what's interesting is, what's important about this story that I just read you is that the point of this genealogy is to show how Cain's sin flowed down and affected the generations that came after him. Did you notice that? Cain's sin was murder. He killed his brother Abel, and he was subsequently cursed. And that continued on and got worse as time went on in his line, until finally we come to his great-great-grandson, Lamech, okay? Remember, Cain had been cursed from the ground, so much so that the ground wouldn't produce anything for him. And so he had to be a wanderer, he had to be a nomad. And necessity is the mother of invention. You ever heard of that? You see how his children and his sons and grandsons, they were tent dwellers, and they raised livestock, and they made music and iron tools. They spread throughout the world, and all those things came from Cain's family, but so did sin. Look at verse 24 again. If Cain is avenged 7 times, so Lamech kills somebody. He says if Cain's avenged 7 times, then Lamech 77 times. You ever heard language like that before in the Bible? Where is that? Right. So let's look at that. Turn over real quick into Matthew chapter 18. This is verse 21 of Matthew 18, 21 and 22. Then Peter came up to Jesus and asked, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times? And Jesus answered, I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. And then he goes on to tell his parable. And so Lamech, because of the spread of sin through Cain's generation, became a murderer. He was filled with anger. And he claims vengeance 77 times over if somebody kills him. Jesus, bringing love and righteousness to the world, claims forgiveness 77 times over. Forgiveness of sin is the opposite of vengeance for it, right? And so we see a change from the corruption of humankind, who for their own sin expected vengeance. When Jesus came, he spread love and forgiveness, and 77 times over. Let's look at the end of chapter 4 of Genesis now. Sure.
When we read in Romans 4 and 5, we read the same principle there. Through Adam, we've sinned. Sin has abounded through humanity. In Christ, we receive grace, and grace abounds much more.
Good.
And that is a good point to think about if you need a forgiveness.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for bringing that up. Look at chapter 4, verses 25 through the end. Adam made love to his wife again. So Cain's already had all these kids. You notice? He already has a great-great-great-grandson who's Lamech, who just talked these things. And now Adam has another kid, and they name him Seth. Seth means granted or given, like it was a gift. God has granted me another child in the place of Abel since Cain killed him. Seth also had a son and named him Enosh. And at that time, people began to call on the name of the Lord. That's an interesting statement. Have you ever thought about that? To call on the name of the Lord had a kind of a more official meaning. I think it means that they started worshiping God in a, probably had an altar or maybe some sort of temple or something like that. People started a religion and sacrifices and worship of the Lord. And that was a counter to Cain's line's sinfulness. The godly line of Seth, from which Noah will come, starts worshiping God. Humanity then has not become fully corrupt, is the point. God has kept a remnant, even though there's so much sin and wickedness in the world. And so look at what happens with Seth's line. This is chapter 5. This is the written account. Another way of saying this is the Toledot of Adam's family line. When God created mankind, he made them in the likeness of God. He created them male and female. He blessed them and named them man, or actually, literally, he named them Adam when they were created. When Adam had lived 130 years, he had a son in his own likeness and in his own image, and he named him Seth. Isn't that interesting? God creates man in his likeness and image, and now Adam has a son who is in his own likeness and image. Remember when we talked in Genesis 1 about what it means to be made in God's image, I mentioned how image was another word for idol, right? Other gods, the idea was these stone idols, these wooden idols, these statues weren't just stone or wood. People thought that the spirit of the god would come and dwell in them. And so they worshiped these things thinking it has a God in it. But God made living images, living idols, so to speak, put his Holy Spirit in us and made us and put us all around the world to be his representatives. And the point of Genesis 5, where God creates Adam in his image and Adam has Seth in his image, seems to me to be saying that this blessing, this original idea that God had for people to be fruitful and multiply and spread God's image and his likeness through all creation, to rule and subdue as his stewards, that blessing had not been revoked. It continues. Right? God's original plan continues. Cain and his line are lost in sin, but God has maintained his will for this remnant of humanity that continues. In biblical history, there's always this idea that even if there's this whole world that's sinful, or most of the nation of Israel is sinful, God keeps for himself a remnant, a small amount of people that are faithful to him. You can see that throughout the Old Testament especially, and then the church becomes God's remnant of holy people in the world. Well, even here we see this. There are still people, or at least one person when it comes to Noah, who is faithful to God, and God can continue his plan to bless the earth, bless the world, for people to be fruitful and multiply. He always holds on to that remnant, and he will until the end. Did you notice in verse 2, it mentions he created them male and female and blessed them in God's likeness. As these genealogies are father to son, but we can't forget, God created women in his image and in his likeness, just like men, right? And that's the second time that the author of Genesis mentions that. So there's this long genealogy in chapter 5 of 10 names, right? And this takes us from Adam to Noah. It's exactly 10 names in this. And then in chapter 10, we'll learn from Noah's son Shem, 10 names from Shem all the way to Abraham, right? So we have 2 genealogies of 10 names each that lead us from Adam all the way to Abraham, who God does amazing things with, right? That reminds me of Jesus' genealogy. Do you remember in Matthew 1, how many names were there between Abraham and David? 14. He makes a point of saying that. And how many names from David to Jesus? 14. And he's saying, look, there's this continuity, God had this plan. Like he's been setting this all up. There's the perfect, remember 14 is 7 plus 7, right? And so there's this perfect plan that God has, and he brings Jesus out of all these people. He was his plan. Luke, we talked about this, Bob mentioned this. Luke actually has a different genealogy than Matthew with some different names in it. But his point is different. He goes all the way back from Jesus being born with his human father, Joseph, going all the way back to Adam. And the idea that Luke is the point he's making is that human history has been going all the way up to this point until we get to Jesus. This has been God's plan. And so back to our genealogy in Genesis 5. It seems pretty clear. Moses is trying to prove a point here. He's showing that history has been moving along to get to this man, Abraham, and his children, the people of Israel. Right? God has been planning it all along. And Genesis becomes focused on Abraham, and the whole Old Testament is about his family, the Jews. Now, it talks a lot about these people and their long lifespans. Have any of you ever given thought to how long these people live? 969 years. Do you wish you could live that long? No? When modern people read this, I've heard a lot of people say, well, this just proves that this is all made up, right? This is all a myth because people don't live that long and they can't live that long. Well, I'm not a scientist or a doctor. I don't know how long people could live. But this doesn't read like a made up myth. Who would put a genealogy with people's real names and their exact ages? Why not say they lived 1,000 years or they lived 900 or something like that? It just doesn't seem to fit in a made-up myth. And why would we even need to know people like Enosh or Jared or Methuselah when they play no other part in the story if this were all being made up, right? It's important to note that in Genesis 6, God does limit their lifespan. It's brought up. There's a reason for it. He says, my spirit will not contend with humans any longer. But some people have tried to make these lifespans seem a little less, a little more palatable to modern people. And so they've done some mathematical gymnastics to try to find out how these people could have lived similar amounts of time to us. And one of the things that they often say is that ancient people might have had a different way of tracking numbers of years. Perhaps they didn't use base 10 as their numbering system. They used something else. Or some people have tried to put a decimal point in the numbers. For instance, Methuselah, instead of living 969 years, lived 96.9 years, right? But we know the ancient people lived off a 360-day-a-year calendar. We're 365, but ancient calendars were all 360. So it's pretty close. And Jewish Semitic people used base 10 for their numbering, just like we do. They counted the same way we do, And if you use that decimal point idea, Enoch was 65 when he had his first child. And so if you put the decimal point 1 up, he would have been 6.5 years old when he had his first kid. It doesn't add up. It doesn't make sense to try to, all these different things that people try to do. And in my opinion, the best way to take this is that these numbers are legit. People lived this long, back before the flood. And interestingly, we actually have another ancient list with people who lived incredibly amounts of time before the flood. We have a list of Sumerian kings. Sumer was one of the most ancient cities, right? And there's a list that contains eight kings. And for these 8 kings, they lived a combined 241,200 years. or they reigned that long. The shortest one reigned 18,600 years. Now that does seem crazy, and we would be apt to say that's obviously made up. But one commentator notes that that culture actually didn't use base 10. They used something called the sexagesimal system. I think that means it's based on 6 instead of 10. I am not a mathematician. I don't understand how it works, but I know that in that system, 36,000 years would equal about 1,000 years. And so if there's something to this list, that would put the lifespan of these kings roughly about the same range that people were living in Genesis. And so there might be something to that as well, that these ages, I think people really did live this long, right outside of Eden, right at the beginning. And yet God recognized that if he let people live this long, the spread of sin would get uncontrollable. Remember how I talked about what if Hitler lived 900 and some years? How terrible that would be for the world. God recognized that. Look at one name. I want to look at one name in this genealogy in particular. Well, actually two, but the first one is Enoch. We're familiar with Enoch. Let's read chapter 5, verses 21 through 24. When Enoch had lived 65 years, he became the father of Methuselah. And after he became the father of Methuselah, Enoch walked faithfully with God 300 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Enoch lived a total of 365 years. Enoch walked faithfully with God. Then he was no more, because God took him away. Enoch is the 7th in the list from Adam in Seth's line. Do you know who the 7th was in Cain's line? Lamech, the guy who killed those people, the guy who wanted vengeance 77 times over. Enoch plays the counter to him. As Cain's line produced a murderer, Seth's line produces a man who walks with God, right? Lamech feared death and judgment. Enoch didn't face death because God took him. Walking with God means living in a holy, upright manner. And Noah is also described this way, as walking with God. Literally, if you read verse 24, it says, Enoch was walking with God, and then he was not, because God took him. He was not. Enoch is a mysterious figure because of this passage. And Jewish legends sprung up about him as being the first prophet. And so there are 3 books in Jewish writings in what's called the pseudepigrapha of Enoch. Have you heard of these? First Enoch, Second Enoch, and Third Enoch. First Enoch is the most famous book in the pseudepigrapha, and I have the pseudepigrapha in my office. It's 2 volumes. They're about that thick, right? But First Enoch is pretty famous. I actually hear sometimes people talking about First Enoch nowadays. But this pseudepigrapha, that word, those types of books, pseudepigrapha means false authorship or false writing. Not false in the sense that it's untruthful, but in that it was attributed to a famous historical person who didn't really write that. And I think that people understood this wasn't really written by Enoch. This is just a literary technique that this person is using. First Enoch was written around 300 years before Christ. And the whole book is presented as a prophecy about the future from Enoch. So Enoch, the 7th from Adam, is telling how all of world history is going to go and what happens with all the Jews and all those things, right up to where the Jewish Messiah comes. But it's really just, since we know it's a false author, it's just a unique way of recounting what's happened in Israel's history. I've read it. It's a long book, and some of its stuff is really interesting, and some of it is not interesting at all and really boring. But there's a part called the Book of Animals, where, in the Book of Enoch, where the author describes historical people like Abraham, like Noah, like David, like the coming Messiah. He describes them in terms of different animals. And you can tell who they are by the way he describes them. It's really interesting. And why I'm bringing this all up is there's a part in First Enoch called the Book of the Watchers. And that's an expansion on Genesis 6, which we'll get to soon. The story about how the sons of God went into the daughters of Eve. And what's most interesting is, First Enoch is not Scripture. We shouldn't take any theology from the book of Enoch. But it is quoted in the New Testament. It's quoted in the book of Jude. So Jude says in verse 14, Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesied about them. He's talking about false teachers. See, the Lord's coming, and thousands upon thousands of his holy ones, to judge everyone and convict all of them of all the ungodly acts they've committed in their ungodliness and all the defiant words ungodly sinners have spoken against him. That's a quote from First Enoch. 2 Peter makes a reference. And so Enoch became a very famous person, right? All these ideas sprung up around him because here's a guy who didn't die. God took him. He was faithful to God. He walked with him, and God took him. And then we get to Noah. Look at chapter 5, verse 28. When Lamech had lived 182 years, he had a son, and he named him Noah, and said, he will comfort us in our labor and painful toil of our hands, caused by the ground the Lord has cursed. Noah's name, Noach, means rest. Why do you think that'd be significant? We've learned about rest a lot, haven't we, in the Bible so far. And Lamech, his dad, that's not the bad Lamech, different Lamech again. Two Lamechs, two Enochs. Noah's father Lamech's hope was that Noach would bring Nacham, comfort, from the painful toil, from their work, from the cursed ground. So there's a play on words there with Noah and comfort. But there's also a play on ideas. So the rest that Noah is supposed to bring the world from the painful toil that they've all been under because of the curse, that rest is going to bring comfort to humanity. Now, this is interesting because God's intention in the beginning with the Sabbath was that humanity would be at rest. Not just one day a week, but always. And remember, when we talk about the Sabbath, that's not taking a nap. It's not God sleeping. It's a way of saying that God is in control. So you don't have to be up in arms. You don't have to be worried. God has everything ordered in creation. It's all going to work fine. Noah's obedience to God would bring that kind of rest. That was the prophecy. That was the hope. Adam's sin brought painful toil instead of rest, labor. Cain became a restless wanderer, right? Because he didn't obey God. But Noah's going to bring rest. In chapter 6, which we'll get to next time, God looks at humankind. He looks at how sinful everyone has become. And he says that he regrets making mankind on the earth. What's weird is that word regret is the same word that Lamech uses for comfort. Noah's going to bring comfort. God regrets. Both are the same word in Hebrew, nacham. So Noah would bring comfort from their painful labor, but God regretted that he made man on the earth. So we already have this idea that Noah, and through Noah's line, God is going to reestablish rest. He's going to make things right. He's going to be in control of the world again. He's going to bring comfort. But you know what? Everybody dies except for Noah, and we start back again. But from Noah, the reason why he brings rest is because from his line, Jesus comes. And so when you think about it like that, some of the New Testament verses that you hear really ring a different sort of bell. Like, for instance, this: come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I'm gentle and humble in heart, and you'll find rest for your souls. Coming to Jesus is that kind of rest from the curse, from the painful labor of the world, from the sin and wickedness, right? And so let's actually read. I'm going to read the first part of Genesis 6. This is one of the most debated chapters in the Bible, I think. So I'm going to read the first 8 verses. When human beings began to increase in number on the earth, daughters were born to them. The sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. And then the Lord said, my spirit will not contend with humans forever, but they are mortal. Their days will be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterwards, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were heroes of old, men of renown. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. So the Lord said, I'll wipe from the face of the earth the human race I've created, and with them the animals, the birds, and the creatures that have moved along the ground. But I regret that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. You know, in that there are so many obstacles, major obstacles to interpreting this. So first, in 6:1 through 4, is this continuing the genealogical stuff from chapter 5, or is this setting us up for the reason why God destroyed the earth, that the sons of God went into the daughters of men? Is this the reason why humanity became so corrupt? About adding to the genealogy. Is the fact that the sons of God married the daughters of men the reason why God became angry and destroyed the world with a flood? Was this an explanation for why people were evil, or is it something else? Is it just an interesting aside about humanity? Who are the sons of God, for one thing? And who are the daughters of men? And why even mention this? What does the phrase, my spirit will not contend with them forever, mean? Does it mean the Holy Spirit was in human beings still? In the same way he lives with us? Why 120 years? Even Abraham lived 50 years more than 120 years, 55. But humans don't live past 120, have you noticed? I don't think anybody in historical record recently that I know of. What are the Nephilim? And were they the result of the sons of God going into the daughters of men and conceiving them, or were they just on the earth at the same time? It's unclear. Why do the Nephilim show up before the flood and after in the book of Numbers if everybody was killed? How can God regret something he did? That just seems like it wouldn't be possible for God. It sounds like, does it suggest that God's making a mistake? What does that even mean? And if everyone in the world was so depraved and corrupt, how did Noah maintain this blameless life? Why him? And the last question is, why, after asking all these intriguing questions, is our time up and I need to stop? And you'll have to come back. So this coming week will be the vote during the Sunday school. We'll be talking about how our church is doing financially and stuff as well. The week after that, Jeff Justice is going to be teaching instead of me because I will be out of town at my brother's wedding. And then we'll get back to this in 3 weeks. So